Okay, wait, let me look at the time.
It's only 4 to 5 minutes. It's really limited time. I just want to
Okay. Do you want me to sign up? Should I still sign up?
Yeah, you should try it. Like, something that works for both. I mean, because I might end up like
Yeah.
Good morning. How's everybody doing?
Okay.
Enthused? Excited? Glad to be in a group. Celebrated President's Day in a big way. Did you guys have class yesterday?
No.
We get screwed on these Tuesday, Thursday classes, by the way. We get like no holidays this entire semester. All right, we're starting off with a UI. By the way, today, modality and heuristic evaluation. Very fun. Very exciting. Yeah. Does anybody know this website? So this is a classic, one of the few like websites out in the world that's kind of untouched since the 90s. And we'll just briefly go through a little bit of this website because it's on the theme, I think, of heuristic evaluation, where you can be looking at this thing and think to yourself as we go through this, like, what is good and what is bad, and what heuristics could you use to justify complaints against the Space Jam website? What should I click? Somebody pick something.
Jump station.
Jump station, that sounds good. Cool links and hijinks.
Oh my God.
Click above to find out more about our sponsors and the various hip sites that make WB Online the jammin' place that it is. And I guess this is a link map. It is. It's an image map. So I can click other links over here or links. And the window maybe. The window seems to do something, but only this little piece of the window. Okay. Cool. What else? Should we try? Sitemap. That sounds bad. Oh dear. Okay. So that's no fun. That's an explanation of everything that's here.
Junior Jam.
What's that?
Junior Jam.
Junior Jam. What could be more junior? Oh God. Okay. Meet the characters. Neat stuff to look at. The coloring book. Basketball tips and terms. Ooh, spinning. Spinning games. Click on the different parts of the picture above for lots of fun and games. I dig it. Michael Jordan over there.
Press box shuttle.
What's that?
Press box shuttle.
Press box shuttle. Press box shuttle. Oh God. No Space Jam news at the moment. Go back to the Space Jam homepage to see more of the site. That's tragic. And if there hasn't been any news since 1992 or whatever.
Space Jam reboots.
Yeah. Lunar Tunes, that's going to be great. Ooh. Wow, that's interesting. So that actually redirects us to something modern. That's an interesting contrast. Behind the jam? Wow. Cool. Yee.
Wow.
So they're really big on these image maps. That's the thing.
Yep.
Huh. Yikes. GeoCities? All right. So that is the Space Jam website. I couldn't think of anything better to go through today. But that is a classic from the mid to late 90s that will get you in the spirit of identifying problems in user interfaces, which is kind of the theme for today. So step one, we're going to take one little step backwards to something that ostensibly we should have covered back in conceptual model days, and talk a little bit about modality and modes. So what is a mode? Anybody? A mode in a user interface is basically any situation you can get into where doing the same thing, like the same sequence of clicks or drags or pokes or whatever you got, in two different times, in two different situations, will have different effects. So what is an example of a mode in a user interface? There's lots of them, but give me one or two. Yep.
Insert mode.
Okay, so like insert / overtype, those two options are different modes in the user interface. Show an example of that in a sec. Mina.
We have a watch and different modes to like set a timer or something.
Yep, so we've talked a little bit about like watches and clocks are kind of famously modal because they don't have a whole lot of room for buttons. True? Others? Yep.
Incognito mode.
Yeah, all right. Incognito mode is a modality. That one, they do a pretty decent job of kind of at least telling you that you're in that mode. Is that true? Yep.
When your car is in reverse or drive.
Okay, true enough. So if you're in reverse and you hit the gas, something very different from if you're in drive happens. Yep.
Cars also have like eco mode.
Yeah, so my car's got like sport and normal and eco and all sorts of buttons and thingies you can hit. True. And then not only do pedals have different effects, but it has an impact on your energy use and such. Yep.
Many smartphones nowadays have a power save mode.
Yeah, so there's things like power save mode or airplane mode or like different things you can throw your phone into. So a few other canonical examples. The mother of all modalities is the caps lock. So if you have the caps lock down or don't have the caps lock down, very different things could happen when you type on the keyboard. Things like this second button on a calculator, where you hit that and then you hit the button that you wanted to actually do the yellow thing above. Anytime you see like a checkbox in a user interface, it's a good sign that it's hinting at a mode. And so turning spell check or correct spelling automatically on and off changes what happens as you're typing on the keyboard and the character stream is going in and then the character stream is showing up in the user interface. If this is turned on, maybe it will change it. If it's turned off, it won't. You talked about overtype versus insert mode, so changing just the behavior of how your cursor works and what typing on the keyboard does within the context of your document. Related to modality, although a little tangential, are these things called modal dialogues. And in the desktop Windows era, this was like the big way that modality presented itself, was through modal dialogues. Things like this will delete the selected customer, are you sure? And it's called a modal dialogue because it stops you from doing whatever you were doing before. It takes you out of edit the document mode or draw pictures in Photoshop mode, pops up this thing and doesn't let you get on with your business. Intended mostly to prevent errors. That's usually why people do these things, to catch your attention and say are you really sure? But they're often just ignored. There's a process called habituation where people kind of get used to these dialogues and just ignore them. At best, you're hoping that they will do something useful for you once. The extreme version of this is a phenomena called focus stealing, which is where you're typing along and one of these modal dialogues pops up unexpectedly. What is the problem here? you're typing along in WordPad and this thing pops up.
You might just press like enter and it
Yeah, so these buttons, they even bother to tell you, have like shortcuts for restart now, hit N, restart later, hit L. And if you're not really staring at the screen and you're just typing along, inputting whatever text you wanted to input, you may very well choose one of these things without realizing you ever had a choice to make. So it's focus stealing because it is taking the focus of your keyboard. So the app that is getting your keystrokes becomes the modal dialog instead of WordPad. Here's a question for you. This thing is the like ribbon bar over on the left in Photoshop, and it lets you choose between like, am I in eyedropper, thing, or am I painting, or am I drawing? Is this modal? Nina?
Yes, because you can actually select different tools from like little icons. So, like you can do something instead of the eyedropper, it would change the mode of like that.
Okay, so there's one, hidden features in here, and two, there is some modality. Any differing opinion? Anybody want to claim no? So I have mixed feelings about this. Raskin would tell you no, that if the mode is kind of essential to the task, if it's your locus of attention, if it's the thing you're like actually focusing on, then it doesn't quite count as a mode in the like negative sense of the term mode. But clearly, I mean, we call these things like eyedropper mode and paintbrush mode and pencil mode. So there's some give and take here. And where this often gets people, I think, in Photoshop is if you like Alt-Tab over and do something else in some other program, and then you come back and you're expecting to be, I always just assume I'm in marquee mode because I don't have the talent to use any of the other tools. And so when I come back, if I'm actually in like erase mode or magic wand or some crazy thing, then it will be confusing to me because I expect it to be marquee. So here's a kind of more formal definition of modes and modality, and this is by Jeff Raskin from the Humane Interface. He says an human-machine interface is modal with respect to a given gesture when one, the current state of the interface is not the user's locus of attention, and two, the interface will execute one among several different responses to the gesture depending on the system's current state. So this gets in this notion of like, it only counts as a mode if the user's not actively attending to it, which keeps coming up through Raskin's work. He's big on these sort of active modes. So when would you use a mode if we're coming out and saying that modes are kind of ostensibly bad? Mostly we use them to temporarily restrict users' actions. So that's the sort of modal dialogue that says like, we're not letting you go on with your life until you tell me the answer to this. And then also when you're being very clear and logical and it's visible and like you really do have different modes. So that's another argument in favor of the kind of Photoshop modality, is that you really are doing very different things. You have one input device, which is your like mouse, and you have like one point of reference, which is your cursor. And you need that cursor and mouse to do many very different things. And so maybe it is appropriate to have some sort of modality there as long as you like really clearly indicate it. So why are they problems if they have some benefits? They're problems because there's a big memory burden. You have to like really be attending to your task and remembering what mode you're in, or else you're very likely to make errors. And so a lot of your like classic desktop computing usability errors come from poor use of modes and modality. I think this is only getting worse as people are paying less attention to what they're doing. So there used to be all this HCI literature on like how you keep your user focused, like how you keep their locus of attention rock solid for 40 minutes at a time or an hour at a time, and like how you avoid any distractions in the user interface that would pull them away from that focus. The reality at this point is that nobody's paying attention to anything for that long. And so modes have become more of a challenge, if anything. So how do you fix the problem? Well, one, don't use modes. Redesign systems to be modeless when possible. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Integrate modality tightly into the workflow. So again, that's back to the Photoshop thing where you're like really actively managing how the modes work. And then display modal state prominently. This is a example of a stop sign in, let's say, France, that shows you kind of what the state of this stop sign is. Like, these other people also have stop signs, or these other people don't have stop signs. It's just an example of like showing state. Yep.
What does it mean to integrate modality tightly?
By that I mean things like the Photoshop example, where like you really are constantly changing modes and like really actively managing it. So as opposed to like I set it once every hour and then forget about it, the sort of like I'm changing every 30 seconds or I'm changing every minute seems to work better for people because they remember that they just made that change. Other questions? Yep.
Going back to the dialog boxes, how is that modal? I don't.
It's modal in the sense that if you're typing along in a document and you keep hitting the keys that you're hitting, they will stop doing what they were doing before because this thing has like come up and taken you out of that flow. So it's changing the mode of your input to redirect it to something else. All right. So imagine you wanted to set the time on this clock. And by default, like the UI that you were given to work with is you have one button that toggles whether or not you're in set mode, and you have one button that advances, but only when you're in set mode. So you go set or not set, and then advance the minute. How could you redesign this to be better? Take 30 seconds and sketch something or think of something that would be better than this. At least not modal like this. What could we do? What would be crafty? How do I get rid of this modality? Yep.
You could have just a +1 minute and a -1 minute button.
Okay, so it could look something like this. Like you don't need that set time crap. You've just got add time and remove time. Many alarm clocks have another mode, which is the like I want to set the time mode versus I want to set the alarm clock mode versus the I just want to view the time right now mode. How would you incorporate that into our modeless design? How would you deal with this I want to set the alarm time thing? Yep.
We have two displays, one for the current time and one.
Second display. There are clocks that do that have like a little tiny 7-segment display down here that says the alarm time. How would you change it then?
Have two separate one.
Okay, so you could have like ± clock and ± alarm. Any other thoughts? Yep.
You have one where you hold the alarm or hold another button down and then press up and down.
Okay, so you're getting into the next slide. You could do something crafty where you hold down one button and press some other things up and down. Yep.
Is that not modal?
Sort of is. We'll get there. What else could you do? Basically, the fundamental trade-off is that to decrease modes, you have to add affordances. You have to add signifiers. You have to keep adding stuff to your UI. And so you could just keep putting more displays up here, and you could put more buttons, and you could really get very direct manipulation with your alarm clock. But there is some utility to the abstraction that modes give you. Like, you know, if you can get your user to understand what they're doing, it's not all bad. And so a common solution to that is what Raskin calls the quasi-mode, which is any sort of mode that is like actively engaged. So we've already said that the problem with modes is that users forget what mode they're in, and then when they press the button, they get angry and that something unexpected happened to them. If you can actively engage the user in like making the mode happen, then you're in a better position there because the user is kind of consciously and continuously saying, like, I still want to be in this mode. So things like shift keys, foot pedals, pull down menus, things where the actual like physical muscle tension in the body will remind the user that they are in this wacky mode. also known in the literature as spring-loaded modes. What's the oldest, most famous quasi mode? What's the classic example of this? Yeah.
Shift.
What's that?
The shift.
Okay, the shift key. Go before computers, before typewriters.
Clutch on a car.
Clutch on a car is good. That is a quasi mode. That is, you're saying I'm going to temporarily enter this mode where I'm going to shift gears. Good. Go even older. Yep. Yeah, so pedals on the piano are like the canonical classic quasi mode, where you are actively engaging some different setup for your piano, but it only persists as long as you kind of keep holding it down. So modern day example of that would be something like the function key, where you hold down the function key and then something very different happens. What I think is interesting about this is if you take Apple's example literally, they got so fed up with even quasi modes that they just inverted these. So now when you hit these buttons, they do the modal thing instead of doing the non-modal thing, which I think is even more confusing. So if you actually want F4, you have to hold down the function key, instead of if you want dashboard, holding down the function key. Thoughts, questions? Modality? We good? All right, so modality is in this set of slides because you need it kind of to understand some of the usability heuristics. Everybody do their reading? Hooray. This one is worth doing. This is the sort of thing that in this class, we have kind of two buckets of readings. Some of the readings are very academic and I think interesting for their own sake. They make you a better educated person. Some of them are very practical. Heuristic evaluation is the sort of thing that people in UX positions actually do and go out in the world and perform. So it's useful to be aware of these. We are going to kind of flip through all of the 10 Nielsen heuristics and give examples of them. I'll do this fairly quickly. So if you have any questions, stop me, raise your hand and let me know what's up. And otherwise, we'll just cruise through this. So anyway, the point of a usability heuristic is that it's a rule of thumb. It is some way of describing what is good about a usable system. And then you can apply that to a system and judge that system based on whether or not it follows those heuristics. So this is a kind of rule of thumb for when you're lacking a really formal model that explains exactly how and why a user interface is good or bad. And the reality is that we don't really have those. We don't have formal models that describe precisely when a user interface is a good thing and when it's a bad thing. These can be used as design principles, so you could use them early in the design process. They're also kind of the first pass at evaluation. So as we're in our big circle over here, we've done ideation, that was our brainstorming bit, and idea selection. This is kind of part of the idea selection process. And then the real meat of design and evaluation starts with heuristic evaluation. And so just an example of something that would be a heuristic is minimize user's memory load. The actual usability evaluation mechanism called heuristic evaluation was developed by Jacob Nielsen back in 1994. This was developed essentially for kind of shrink-wrapped software packages, though it applied very nicely to the web and became kind of the start of usability work on the web. And they hold up surprisingly well, actually, for mobile and kind of modern web app stuff. I could not find a picture of Jacob Nielsen where he didn't look evil. So he's a nice guy. I've met him. He's not actually evil, as far as I know. Anyway, so you get three to five people together. You have them examine the UI. This is called a usability inspection method. And the evaluators have a list of things that they are looking for, and they just go through the entire user interface and check and see which parts of your UI fit those rules and which parts of them are against those rules. The evaluators will find very different problems from each other. They will then get together afterwards and put them all back together. And you use those things that you found, issues that you found in the UI, to redesign or to fix problems. That's the whole concept. And notably, this can be done on a working UI or on sketches. And so at kind of every iteration of your design cycle, you're going to do this heuristic evaluation process where you go in and you say, does this thing still make sense, from an inspection perspective? And part of the reason that you do this with experts before you go out and do real user studies, you may have learned in your individual design 1.2, whatever we call that thing, where you were supposed to make paper prototypes and go out and talk to people, that like lay people on the street sometimes have a little bit of trouble dealing with paper prototypes. It's a little too high concept sometimes for people to really kind of get their head around what they're seeing. You, however, the now educated non-masses, are supposed to be able to look at a paper prototype and see through it, see to what the actual implementation would be, how it would work in the real world. And so you are now these sorts of experts that you would bring in to do this sort of heuristic evaluation on a paper prototype. So to do heuristic evaluation, you need heuristics. I want to point out that like while this list is famous and canonical within its space, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these lists of heuristics out in the world. So there are heuristics for API design, and there are heuristics for IDE design, and there are heuristics for mobile design and persuasive design and ubiquitous computing. Anything you can imagine, like some academic somewhere has written a list of heuristics that are kind of derived from best practices. These ones are just the famous Nielsen ones. Yep.
What's the H2 stand for?
So H is heuristic, very clever. 2 is, these were Nielsen's second set of heuristics, that's all. But nobody remembers the first one because nobody uses them anymore. So everybody just uses the H2 1 through 10s at this point. Cool? Okay. H2.1, visibility of system status. So this is all about just keeping your user informed of like what's going on behind the screen, what is driving the program and what its current state is. So this is kind of where modality comes into play. You try to make system status very visible if you do have modes by presenting it clearly. A big example of visibility of system status are these sorts of things where you want to go off and do something computationally intensive, or you have to wait for something and you didn't learn how to do asynchronous programming, and so you need to just freeze your entire UI. The traditional Windows hourglass, which I think they don't actually use anymore, was the way of telling people that that was happening. OS X has the beach ball of death. These sorts of things that tell you like, I'm doing something, don't worry, it's gonna be great. And then maybe they'll come back and maybe they won't. Same deal with like longer delays. You shouldn't ideally hourglass or beach ball somebody for like longer than 10 seconds. Like everything goes to hell after that. You're just asking to get force quit. And so if you're going to do something that's going to take a whole lot longer, then you need to start talking about like real progress bars. So download progress bars, or Shazam's thing that's like, I'm really doing something right now. Like, don't close me. I'm trying to get work done. Tells the user, here's how it's going and everything's fine. We're making progress. Come back in 2 minutes. Don't worry about it. Just understand that anytime you break flow by more than, here I put 10 seconds, but I think the reality is probably closer to 3. Like, you're going to lose your user. They're going to go do something else, and they'll be back eventually, and you're going to have to remind them of what they were doing when they come back. Welcome to designing for like the ADD generation. Okay, and then visibility of system status part 2. This is just kind of telling users what's going on. So compare these two modal dialogues here. Which of them do you think is preferable? Are they the same? Please.
So the first one gives you like that warning that if you don't save, you'll lose everything. Well, if I don't apply now, maybe just apply apply, change later, like.
All right, so the first one is more specific, more concrete about the consequences of your actions. Agreed.
If I just read the buttons, it's more clear what the first one does than the second one.
Okay, so we have don't save, save, cancel, don't apply, cancel, apply down here. Yeah, okay, I don't like either of these a whole lot, but agreed. Yep.
Cancel and don't apply or cancel and don't save those things back.
Yeah, so this is like your classic HCI problem of like, which of these buttons are the same and which are different. It happens that all three of these things here are different because this is like delete my changes, this is take me back to editing, and this is save my changes. But I still don't know that that's entirely clear. There used to be a webcomic called OK Cancel that was like all about user experience design, and it's this classic thing in HCI. The other thing that's more concrete about this one is that it at least tells you exactly what's happening. So like you did work on statements.txt. Like if you don't save them, those things you just changed will go away. Whereas this is a little more vague. It's like you did something. And so this assumes that you did this recently. So you remember what happened, what you changed in your network pane. But if you like made those changes and then wandered off and did something else and then came back and were like, why is this open, and closed it, you might lose track of like what was going on there. Thoughts, questions? Yeah.
I just have a question about the heuristic evaluation in general. So in the reading, I think it was talking about how it's a little bit different than user testing.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it seems like it's kind of like a subset, and I'm just a little confused on like what they're considering as user testing and how is it different.
We'll get a little bit more into that, and then of course later in the semester, next 2 weeks from now, we'll have like a whole lecture on user testing. But basically, the idea testing happens with real users. So you go out and you find the people that would be the customers for your product, the users of your product, and you do the user testing with them, preferably in context. So you like take your thing out and you videotape and you watch people like actually use it. Whereas heuristic evaluation is not done with real users, it's done with experts. So you get together a group of like UX people rather than a group of your target users. That's the primary difference. The other tends to be less task driven. So heuristic evaluation, usually people just kind of go through the whole interface. Whereas user tests are usually very, very task driven, in short. H22, match system and world. So this is the like heuristic that goes with metaphor and mapping. So if you understood the metaphor and mapping lecture, you're good. And again, you get these like bad examples where to eject the disk, you drag the disk to the trash can. That's not how the real world works. And so that's just an example of like bad metaphor, which is the sort of thing that you would expect your experts to catch as they're going through and doing their heuristic evaluation. Number 3, user control and freedom. More than almost anything in the world, users don't like to be trapped and don't like to be told what they have to do next. And so you end up with like bad dialogues with it like this. The new software requires that you restart your computer now. Click restart to quit all applications and restart. And you have 2 buttons. You can either shut down or you can restart. What's the problem here? You really want the like ain't nobody got time for that button, which belongs over here. And so what really happens is that people like try to drag these little things off the window and be like, just go away. I'll come back to you at some point. And at some point, Windows smartened up on this and gave you the postpone button, and then OS X eventually followed also. Now the problem is that this thing maxes out at like 4 hours or something, and I want the like, never tell me about that again, or I will punch you button. Yeah, so you have this interesting give and take here, where like they really do want you to restart. Like there's a reason they want you to restart. Like you're about to get hacksaw-ed, but you don't want to do that because you got other things to do. It's like completely unrelated to your task. So anyway, the best you can do in this situation is like really tell people what's going on. It's a visibility of system status thing where you say like, really like there's a 0-day exploit and they're coming for you, man, run. Like if that's the case, and if not, give them the postpone button and it'll be okay. Nothing in the entire world is worse than a cancel button that doesn't cancel. And you see those all over the place, where like something is loading in the background and there's a cancel button and you're like, wow, this is taking a long time. And you hit cancel and then it doesn't close the freaking window. That is the most upsetting thing in the entire world. And then undo is a part of this. So like always giving people a way to like back out and get back where they implemented undo. I almost made this an individual programming assignment in this class just because I think everybody should have to do it once. But it is the most awful thing in the entire world to have to implement undo. Go out and like try to do it sometime in a large scale system. It's horrible because you have to adopt all these paradigms where you like keep track of every action that's ever happened and how to undo it and how to redo it. It's miserable. But anyway, it's super important. Another example of this is just offering like exits and not being too direct on how you force people from step 1 to step 2. So the like canonical bad example here are wizards, which are super helpful if you don't know what you're doing. Like as a first run experience, they're okay, and like as like something you do occasionally, wizards are all right. But wizards are obnoxious if there's something that you have to do 10 times an hour. Like you don't really want to have to go through each of these steps. You really want some like direct manipulation-y interface where you can choose the orders in which you set all the settings. Yep.
It's kind of like Microsoft Bob, how pretty much the whole OS is like a wizard.
Sort of, yeah. It's like a wizard where you have to wait for everything to load and the dog to talk to you. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Heuristic 4, consistency and standards. And so this one covers 2 different concepts. One is internal consistency. So do you consistently lay things out in the same order? The canonical bad example here is that people sometimes get wacky and start moving around their OK and cancel buttons. And every now and then you'll find somebody that tries to justify that as a really good design. Like, we have a problem. People don't read modal dialogues. How do I fix it? Let's move the buttons someplace crazy. It's just not really getting at the real problem. And so thinking about these things in terms of being internally consistent, I think is very important. Then the second half of that is being consistent with the rest of the world. So if you can see this, if you're far enough up in the room where you can actually see this screen, what might you imagine is the problem with this web page I'm showing here? Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if the rest of the page is missing, but usually like I'll click one of the radio buttons and I'll press next.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I press one of these radio buttons, will it take me right away to
The rest of the page is missing. Assume there's like a button somewhere.
Okay.
Yep.
Am I supposed to press new customer and then click on the radio buttons, or am I supposed to click?
Right.
There's no need for me to either press the new customer or it's customer.
Right. So these are not, in fact, buttons. New customer and existing customer. These are just headings. And they just, in their CSS, decided they were going to style their H2 headings with these like rounded corners around them. But like this screams button. It's obviously a button and you would want to push it and something to happen. But in fact, nothing will happen. And so this is the sort of thing that actually you might have trouble catching in a heuristic evaluation, but that will always come out in a user test. Because when you go and do your real user testing and you watch somebody actually sit there and bang on this thing, they will sit there and hit that thing 1,000 times trying to make it work. So that is what it is. Basically, you're just trying to obey the conventions of your genre. And mobile has different conventions than web has different conventions than desktop had. So this is where it pays to like be aware. I had a friend who I was very into technology in high school and college and things. And her mother would always say to me, like, when you get to your 20s, you're going to stop using all that technology stuff and you're just going to go do your job. For us, the job is to use all that crap. Like as a UX person, it is your job to be aware of like everything that is going on so that you have some idea of where your users' expectations are moving and how you can keep up with them. All right, error prevention. So I've told you like 100 times that modal dialogues don't work, but nonetheless, They have a purpose, which is to try at least to prevent errors. So eliminate error-prone conventions, check for them, and ask for confirmation. A cooler way to do error prevention is to give people widgets that allow them to enter things in a way that's kind of more semantically in tune with what they want to tell you. So, for instance, here, if I'm flying to New York, or I'm flying from New York to London, and they want me to input a check-in and a check-out date, how do I know whether I'm putting that in the like American month and date order, or if I'm putting it in the like European date and month order? I don't know. But to prevent that error in the first place, I can just give people a calendar where they pop it down and they click the thing and then they're good. And then this also prevents wacky things like I want to check in on April 45th. You can avoid a lot of different errors just by funneling the person in the right direction. Another mechanism of error prevention are these sorts of interactive editors. So who here has ever used Scratch? CS10 is doing its job out there. This is a programming language where it's kind of fundamentally impossible to make syntax errors because you just kind of drag and drop the things and they either fit together or they don't. And if they all fit together, then you're good. Like there's no syntax error. And Lego Mindstorms has a kind of similar thing going on. This is in contrast to like a traditional IDE where you would usually, often you're in a state where everything wouldn't run perfectly right now. Like you're moving things around and you've got gaps in your program and you're going to fill them in later. And like modern IDEs usually tell you when you're in that state. So like Visual Studio or Xcode or Sonoma Studio or whatever will have the little like angry red X over to the left that says, something's wrong here, but eventually when you come back and you fix it, you make the little red X go away. So it's just a way to just not allow wrong input. On the subject of preventing errors, there are these two types of errors that Nielsen talks about. There are slips and mistakes. So slips are you had the correct plan in mind and then you just screwed up actually doing it. And then mistakes are like errors of mental model, like you never had the right plan in the first place. And these are very different things. This one is just like, maybe you could have helped the user a little bit, but basically they just screwed up. This one is the user is completely confused, and you need to kind of rethink how you're presenting the entire concept to them. This is kind of the mother of all usability heuristics, recognition over recall. So here I have the applications folder on OS X. And here I have my command prompt. And the idea here is that users are much more capable of like seeing something they've used before and remembering that it exists and engaging with it than they are to just remember out of the blue how something works or how to get to where they want to be. And so if I know like Firefox is right here and I'm like, I need to go on the web, I might double click Firefox. But if I'm at the command prompt, I would have to actually remember that. I'd have to remember that Firefox exists. And then I would have to remember its name. And then I would have to remember the name of the command to launch it. And it's just a much more complicated way of getting things done. This shows up in a lot of different ways throughout user interfaces. One of the big ones these days is this sort of notion of like open recent files. So here is where I would argue that kind of the desktop metaphor is breaking down. And more people are just kind of using recent items and search and things. But this reduces the user's memory load by showing them on the screen what they want to do. So if I remember like last week I made a poster and it was in Illustrator, I can go to Illustrator and I can go to recent files and there it is. And I don't have to remember where I saved it. I don't have to remember what I named it. I don't have to remember anything. I just have to be able to go to this place and see that it's there and that it exists. And in general, this is true of like anything in a menu. So if I don't have to know that Device Central is a thing, because I don't know what Device Central is. But if it's in that menu, I might serendipitously stumble upon it and try it and find out. So there's ways to learn about things without having to even know that they actually exist. A lot of this is like super obvious, but you would be surprised how much of software engineering it hasn't made it to yet. So still a lot of people use, build tools, for instance. Like Ant is like the mother of all like remember instead of like recall over recognition tools, because you have to just remember exactly what command you wanted to type out in Ant. Lots of really popular tools are really bad at this particular issue. Room for improvement. 7, flexibility and efficiency of use. So having accelerators for experts. So things like these, where you go in and in the menu, you can recognize over recall what it is that you want. But if it's something you do all the time, it tells you just hit whatever the hell that is, Z. This is my problem on OS X. I still can't remember what all these things do or what the symbols for all of them are. I'm going to say Shift Butterfly Z. So Shift Butterfly Z launches Zotero for you. Great. This lets users kind of tailor frequent actions to their own needs and remember easier ways to get to things. The mother of all like accelerators is scripting. So if you can like write macros or you can script your UI in one way or another, then you are getting around these issues of complexity for experts by letting them really get into the internals. Cool? All right, aesthetic and minimalist design. So this will tell you how far we've come as kind of a field. This sort of crap used to be really, really common. This was like the default application look and feel in the mid-90s, so much so that like this is, when you built an application in Visual Basic, this is kind of how it looked by default. This was what the form editor guided you to. This is, was considered a good outcome. Now, this is just chaos, right? Like this isn't the sort of thing we do anymore. So what are problems with this thing? So there's so much stuff. Like there's just so much stuff. What else is bad here? And there's a lot of bad, but yeah.
You can't try one thing at once. It's all or nothing.
Okay, so you got to do everything. Like there is no, there's no try it and see here. You got to hit everything at once. Yep.
You kind of have to make an order in which you enter the information.
Yeah, so you get to choose your own adventure here and come up with like a flow for this thing. And maybe some of it's important, maybe some of it's not. They do tell you, I guess, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's nice of them. They told us that. Probably those are the tab stops, I'm going to guess. But yeah.
The rename button is much larger than the reset button.
Yeah, that's
It's just so frustrating.
we don't do that anymore. It used to be very common. The like default button being bigger than the cancel button. We don't do that anymore. Anything else? Yeah.
All the text is really small and the titles are only really differentiated by folding.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just really impossible to figure out like what's important, what's frequently accessed, where does all of this come from, why does it matter? Here's another example of just kind of putting too much stuff in a dialogue. Like nobody wants to read through all this stuff and figure out everything that's going on here. And so simplify. Like, does this really all need to be here? Could there be defaults? Could there be extras for experts? Like, as an engineer, it can be very tempting to say, like, the system has N capabilities. I have N pixels on the screen. Every capability gets 1 pixel, and you have to fight that sort of instinct to like put everything in front of the user. Just because you spent a bunch of time like software engineering up that feature doesn't mean that it has to be the most prominent thing in the user interface. So stepping back, stepping away from the design and kind of pulling things out of it is a big part of the process. I always tell everybody in these sorts of classes that they need to watch Project Runway, but this is where Tim Gunn would tell you to edit. Nina Garcia would say, you need to edit. All right, present things in a natural order. And as in many fields, we're going to abuse the notion of Occam's razor and say that, the simplest UI is probably the best one. An interesting thing to think about here is that when you make a user interface, you're kind of inherently building a puzzle. That's what you're doing. And you want the puzzle to be as easy to solve as possible. You want whatever the user's kind of first guess at the solution for the puzzle to be the real answer. And so there's extremes of this. The classic example is the Palm Pilot, which there's probably relatively few people in this room that have ever seen. But the original Palm Pilot had a screen and a stylus and 4 buttons at the bottom. And those 4 buttons were like calendar, calculator, probably something else, text. Yeah, notebook was one of them. I don't know what the other one was. Yeah, contact list. And like that's just what those buttons did. There were lots of other things you could do with your Palm Pilot, but if you wanted to do those things, you were going through the screen and the menus and blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you wanted to like quickly do something, you hit those buttons. But you can also try too hard to simplify. So there was an era in Microsoft's history around Office XP, I think, maybe a little bit later, where they decided that dynamic menus were going to be awesome. Anybody remember dynamic menus or can tell me what a dynamic menu is? All right, so what they did was you have your file menu and your edit menu and your whatever menu. They would slowly start taking away things you didn't use, okay? So you would open the menu and one time it would be this long and then the next time it would be this long and the next time it would be this long. And eventually it would get down to like only the things you ever used. Clever in a sense, like I can see why someone thought that was a good idea. The problem you have is that it freaks people out when their like menus are just changing constantly. So people memorize things like the option I want is in like the second half of the list. And then if you suddenly come back one day and half of your list is gone, like even though ostensibly it's more clear now because the option that you want is among fewer choices, it turns out it doesn't actually help all that much with like reducing the cognitive load of this. All right, a few more things. Aesthetic and minimalist design. Over here we have Evite. Over here we have Crusher, 2 different ways of sending invitations. This one just kind of has a lot of stuff going on, and this one doesn't. One of the big challenges in UX at this point, and it's the sort of thing that I think about a lot in a sort of UX strategy role, is how do you trade off between the user's task and monetization? So like Evite went nuts at some point here and put like 1 million ads around their like, how do I actually send an invitation button? And so up here, let's say your task is to send an Evite, which it probably is if you went to evite.com. Which of those buttons sends an Evite? It turns out it's this one right here. But it's not like this big shiny one or this big shiny one or that one. Those are all like monetization features. They're just trying to get you to click on something to spend some money for one thing or another. Cool. PHPMyAdmin, another classic, like everything on the screen at once sort of app. All right, and then the last 2 are about help and error recovery. So H9 is help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. What's good or bad about this modal dialogue? Yeah. Yeah, so what am I agreeing to here? Yes, I have not specified a web browser or web browser specified is incorrect. Yes, okay. Yeah.
Will be given an option to enter your specified, like what do you want to specify?
Yeah, so there's no clue here about how I fix the problem, right? And then, so we're violating like 9 different heuristics here. And then we also get this like forcing the user to like agree when they don't agree. Like, no, everything is not okay. Like, I don't want to say yes. I want to fix this stupid problem. And so this is just bad. Here's an example of a verbose dialogue. This has its good and bads also. These were popular very briefly, still kind of come and go every now and then. The idea here is that you're kind of giving the user all the information. Like, here's everything that went wrong. Here is what's going to happen as a result of this error. Here's how you should fix it. Here's how you can avoid this problem in the future, that sort of thing. Generally, I think these things are probably better than the alternative, which is presenting not enough information. But this would get obnoxious if you had to deal with a lot of these, right? So you need to kind of first prevent errors, and then in the very rare cases that an error occurs, you can be very chatty about how to deal with it. And then also this is getting us into the world of undo again, where like Gmail will say, here's exactly what you just did, so that everybody's aware of the status of the system. Here is how you can learn more about it. Here's how you can undo it. So just recognizing and diagnosing and recovering from errors. And then the last one is help and documentation, which is a big topic that we're not going to get into too much right now. But fundamentally, you should have some way for users to go and find help. Not too long, not too short, focused on the user's task. Types of help include things like tutorials and getting started materials, first run experiences, that sort of thing. Reference manuals are usually geared more at experts than at kind of day-to-day users. Nobody reads the freaking manual. And then short reference cards, tutorials, reminders, tooltips, things like that are other ways of kind of communicating help to the user. So context-sensitive help and search, very clever. Microsoft for a long time did this what's this thing, where you click that in the menu and then you can tap any place in the interface and it kind of tells you how it works. OS X does this clever thing where you can search in the help and it'll highlight in the menus like where the thing that you're looking for is. And then first run experiences are a big part of this. So mobile apps are getting really big on this, where like the first time you open up your app, you get some sort of transparent overlay on top that says like, over here, there's this button you need for this, and over here, there's this button you need for this other thing. Helpful. The big problem people have with these is once they tell them like, all right, I got it, go away. And then 10 seconds later, they're like, oh, wait, how do I X? They don't know how to get it to come back. It's a struggle we fight with a lot in Canoma Studio. Actually, if you got rid of the like welcome screen, people never know how to get the welcome screen back. So first run experiences. Any other questions on the heuristics? Great, because we got to keep moving. All right, programming assignment 2 was done. Congrats. Yay, everyone. Hooray. Many of the projects were very nice. I'm going to, for Thursday's lecture, I think, pick a few of my favorite IPA 1s and IPA 2s and show them off here in lecture, just so people get some idea of kind of the scope of the projects. So if you really don't want me showing off your IPA 1 or your IPA 2, let me know before then. Otherwise, I'm just going to do it. Coming up next, we have the group brainstorm, which is due by end of day tomorrow. Submit on B courses, 1 submission per team. Please read the stupid instructions. Like, you guys are not average users. You don't get the excuse of not reading the instructions. But like most of the questions you have are kind of spelled out either in the text of the instructions or the grading rubric. So ask on Piazza if you're confused, but before you do that, read the instructions. Thoughts, questions, group brainstorm? Okay. Coming up next will be the group contextual inquiry, task analysis, competitive analysis. This will go out probably tonight, maybe tomorrow, and will be due pretty soon, probably by like the end of next week. So you should be thinking as you wrap up your brainstorm assignment about how you're going to find users, because this assignment will require you to actually like schedule some time with prospective users and go and interview them and really dig into the meat of your project. So have that in mind before you go too far. And then our next individual homework, we're taking a couple-week break from the programming assignments, and the next assignment will be an individual heuristic evaluation thing, which we'll talk more about on Thursday. Reading assignments, remember that Thursday's reading is hard. Who's done it already? Who really enjoyed it? Aw, it's tragic. It's very good for you. It's like medicine for the HCI soul or something. Go do it. Have fun. CS160A students, don't forget I gave you a second paper there that will cover quite a bit in lecture, so come prepared on that one also. Topics and readings for next week, still TBD. I'll have that hopefully by Thursday. Decided that one of the topics for next week is boring, so I'm shifting them around a little bit. Any other administrative stuff? All right, so let's go through very quickly the kind of process of actually running a heuristic evaluation. So you've got your UI, and you've got this list of 10 heuristics. Now, how do you combine those two things into a usability inspection method called heuristic evaluation? Basically, there are 4 phases to it. The first one is that you get together a bunch of experts, quote unquote. 3 to 5 is kind of the typical recommendation, and we'll talk more about why. And you provide them with the design and domain knowledge that they need. So you have to tell them kind of something about the context of your user interface. Who is using it? Why are they using it? In what situations are they using it? Or else the evaluators won't be able to kind of fairly evaluate your stuff. Then you have them go and do an evaluation. And basically, we're literally talking about somebody sitting down with your UI in whatever state it's in, 5 experts independently in separate rooms with like Post-it notes and Sharpies, going through your user interface and labeling problems, labeling here in this spot right here, I think there is a violation of heuristic number 7, and then I'll explain why. And here in this spot over here, I think there's a violation of heuristic number 2. And so it's this very, very mechanical process of walking through a user interface and finding violations of those 10 heuristics. Usually we recommend that people work in 2 passes, so they kind of go through everything one time just to get a feel for how it works. And then on the second pass, kind of focus on specific elements and like really dig in. And then each evaluator produces a list of problems. So for each one, they reference the heuristic that is at issue. And you have to be very specific. So you don't say like, boy, this interface violates 7 all over the place. You really say like, right here, there's a problem where I think you have violated heuristic number 7, and here is how you should fix it. How long do you think this process should take? Generally, like how long should a heuristic evaluation be? What's that? Yeah, how long should an individual take? We usually say like an afternoon. Like usually the way you actually run these in real life is that you get together your people and you just block out a day. And so you do your like introduction to the topic area in the morning, and then you have them like start their heuristic evaluation and take a break for lunch and continue their heuristic evaluation. Then you get them all back together for like the debrief in the afternoon. So this shouldn't be a like 2-week thing. For instance, this is a kind of a 1-day learn where your UI is at sort of process. All right, step 3. Everybody has to come up with severity ratings for each problem that they find in the user interface. And the idea is to just kind of rate things on whether they are like cosmetic, don't worry about it sort of problems, all the way up to like, this is a catastrophic usability problem. And the way you do this typically is that each individual evaluator does their own severity rating. And then when you come back together for like the debrief, you as a group hash out a collective opinion on how important each of these usability issues is. And so step 4 is that debrief where you come together and get like both the evaluators and the actual like UI design team together in one room. And here's where you start going from like identification of problems into fixes. Like what could I do to fix this problem? And how hard will it be to fix this problem? And what you're wanting to do is kind of turn this into a real brainstorming session on, I've got all these experts in the room, I want to take advantage of them. How do we head towards solutions to all of these issues? And so notably, we've talked about this mostly as if it's pretty late in the process, like you already have a thing and you're wanting to evaluate it. But you can run these sorts of heuristic evaluations even over just concepts. So this could be part of your idea selection phase in addition to your like real evaluation phase. So here's a concrete example of a heuristic evaluation note, like a heuristic violation. Typography uses mix of upper lowercase formats and fonts. This violates consistency and standards. I'm worried that it's going to slow the user down. You would label this on like a specific part of the interface. So you would say like, here are 2 places where your fonts just aren't consistent. As a fix, I think you should pick one format for the entire interface. And you would pick a severity rating for these things and et cetera. And an interesting thing about this is not the sort of thing you usually find in user testing, because user testing is so task focused that this sort of like cosmetic detail tends to slide. But your experts will catch these sorts of things. The people that are like into the graphic design work will see. Severity ratings are used to allocate resources to fix problems. They are estimates of need for more usability efforts. They are a combination of frequency, impact, and persistence, which this is kind of jargon, but it's important because in many, like when you do real usability studies, you usually separate those out into different things. So you say like users will rarely have this happen, but it's catastrophic when it does happen. Or this will happen all the time, but it's not a big deal. You kind of roll those into one number here when you're doing heuristic valuation. And you do this independently by all the judges. And so the usual levels of severity are like, I disagree that this is an issue, all the way up to fix this today before you go on with anything else. Please. Frequency and persistence is something is not persistent if it can be learned around. So if it's like a discoverability problem, that may be something that is very frequent because like every user that tries it runs into it. But if they then learn how it's properly done and it'll never happen to again, it's not persistent. That's the idea there. Yep.
How often do you see it for?
So when I do like, so I don't do heuristic evaluation very much personally, but when I do like user studies and am pulling these things back from the field, I would say the distribution is probably, if I come back with like 50 usability issues, I would expect 3 or 4 of them to be 4s. And I would expect most of them to be 1s and 2s. Like most of the things you find are cosmetic, actually, in real life. Yep.
Frequency would be across the number of people you're sampling, and
Yeah, that's fair.
across time.
Yeah. Yeah, so frequency is a between subjects thing and persistence is a within subjects thing. Yep.
What is a cosmetic problem? It's not affecting usability, and isn't that just preference?
Well, so no, it can be both. So it's the sort of thing that like slows people down but doesn't stop them. Like it would never stop anyone, but it annoys people. So things like, you know, having weird wording in dialogues are cosmetic problems, and things like distracting fonts or like, why is this blinking over here? And things like that are like cosmetic problems that slow people down but don't fundamentally reflect like errors in mental model. So like as soon as you start getting down into here, you're really talking about like honest mistakes, like things where the mental model of the user and the mental model of the system are completely different. And then up here is more just kind of window dressing differences. You do get a lot of these like 2s. I would say actually the distribution of usability errors when you do like your typical user study is probably something like, you know, this between the like 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s. Like you get more 2s than anything else, a little bit of 3s, very few 4s, and relatively few 1s, because the 1s just don't jump out to you when you're doing a user study. They're not important enough. Other questions? All right, so here's an example of one with a severity rating. So the interface uses the string save on the first screen for saving the user's file, but use the string write file on the second screen. Users may be confused by this different terminology for the same function. What severity rating would you give that on our 0 to 4 scale? It's someplace in the 2-3 neighborhood. Like I can comfortably say that. It's the sort of thing where if, like in a user test, you would know for sure because you would know whether somebody quit. Like if somebody couldn't figure out how to proceed, then it's definitely a 3. If people were just like, what? Then it's probably a 2. And so this is an example of kind of the differences between like a heuristic evaluation and a real user study, is that you have to make a little bit of guesses about how much trouble this sort of thing is going to cause for somebody. let's call it a 3. It's probably a 3-ish issue where like it's going to frustrate people, and maybe 1 in 10 people that runs into it will be like confused enough that they'll take the wrong action. Whereas like severity level 4 things are like everybody that runs into this problem is going to take the wrong action. And severity level 2 things are kind of like nobody that runs into this is going to take the wrong action. They're just going to be kind of frustrated. Make sense? All right, so debriefing. This is just where you get everybody together and start going over design fixes. I think we covered that well enough. Pros and cons of heuristic evaluation. So this is getting into what makes this different from user studies. And again, bearing in mind that we are going to dig into user studies in great depth here in a couple of weeks. We have this part here because heuristic evaluation is kind of the blend between the design world and the evaluation world, whereas real user studies are like deep evaluation, and like the pure conceptual model stuff is very pure designy. I'm very proud of that Converse picture, by the way. It's one of my favorites today. All right, so heuristic evaluation versus user testing. Heuristic evaluation is much faster. We're talking about 1 to 2 hours for each evaluator, an afternoon, something like that, versus days and weeks. So like real user testing is seriously like a month and a half sort of project, depending on where you are in your iterative cycle. Like paper prototype user testing is maybe a week. Testing a like fully fledged product with industrial design around it is going to be a good month-long project. And we're also talking about very different kind of outcomes in terms of what you hand over to the like design team. So a heuristic evaluation, you're probably going to end up with like a bunch of sticky notes and photocopies of your interface with sticky notes on them, and like maybe a 1-page summary, which is like, here are the problems we found, and here's how to duplicate them. Go take a look at this. Whereas like a real user study, like the usability reports that come out of that are small books. They're very different outcomes than a heuristic evaluation. Say my average like usability report that I do for a client is going to be 30 to 50 pages of solid text explaining kind of all the things that happened during the study. So one is a kind of more academic work. Heuristic evaluation is more of a like very loose, here are some hints to help you improve your thing sort of work. Heuristic evaluation doesn't require any interpretation of user action. So this is really the hard part about running real user studies. It's what takes the like trained eye in the user study process, is being able to watch somebody else use the user interface and figure out why are you doing that? Like, what is going on there? And so knowing like when to intervene in a user study and when to ask questions and when to kind of push the user in one direction or another is an art form that I would not expect like a first-year HCI student in this class to necessarily be able to do consistently. Like that's something that requires some practice. Whereas heuristic evaluation is a much more mechanical process, much less open to interpretation, much less qualitative, despite still being very qualitative, much less qualitative than like a real qualitative user study. User testing, by contrast, is far more accurate. So it takes into account actual users and their tasks. And it doesn't have quite the same problem of false positives that a heuristic evaluation can have. So heuristic evaluations tend to raise way more issues than real users will actually have, because experts get super hypercritical about like every little bit of a user interface, even when it's not necessarily super relevant. Yeah, so that I believe that to be true. User testing is much more accurate, but much more subjective. So pros and cons there. And in general, you want to alternate between like inspection methods and real user testing methods. So both of them are very valuable, and you just have to kind of bounce back and forth between them. They find different sorts of problems. And what you really don't want to do is waste participant time, because participant time is really expensive and really difficult to schedule with the like most basic of errors. So why 3 to 5 evaluators? Like why not just choose one? It turns out that if you make a user interface and like purposefully introduce N or K or whatever, if you introduce K errors, usability errors into it, nobody will find all K. Like it's just not how it works. It's too subjective. It's too hit and miss on kind of what part of the interface you focus on. And so some evaluators will find only very easy ones. Some evaluators will find a whole gamut of usability problems. But what's worth noting is that even people who find very few usability problems will sometimes find the very hard problems to find. And so just getting more eyes on it is helpful. This chart is crazy. I think it was this in your reading?
Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully you understand what the hell I'm talking about here, but this is like bad evaluators versus good evaluators, and this axis is like easy to find versus hard to find usability problems. So how many evaluators do you go out there? If you only have one, you tend to only find about 1/3 of the usability problems, which is kind of the situation you get into when like the designer is the only one looking at something, or like you have 2 designers on a team and they're trading designs and looking at each other's stuff. You tend to catch about 1/3 of things. Going all the way up to 5 evaluators will tend to catch you about 3/4 of them. You can just keep adding more people, but of course you're probably paying these people for their time. This is the sort of thing that a consultant comes and does for a couple of days. And adding many more evaluators won't find many more problems. And as always, this really depends on like the size of the market for the problem. So if you're gonna have like 1,000 users and it's really easy to field update your system, then maybe you would just do this with 3 people. If you're shipping like a shrink-wrapped software that's going to go to millions of people and there's no way to update it over the web, over the internet, then you might put 20 people on this because the cost for like fixing a usability problem later is much too high. And it's worth noting that this is a very deep parallel to the process of like categorizing and finding bugs in software. So as you like hire QA people to go through your software and like find software bugs, like real mechanical bugs, so too do you do this process of heuristic evaluation to find the kind of usability bugs, the errors of design. So a couple more charts that were in these papers that you guys read. This is roughly the like % of usability problems that you find over number of evaluators. And this is how much benefit to cost you get based on how much you're paying out to your usability experts. And so you can see there's this knee in the graph that's around like 4 to 5 evaluators. And so that's where people tend to go. Like you're still getting good value for your money up until 4 to 5, and then it kind of tapers off pretty quickly because this levels out. Questions? All right. So in summary, heuristic evaluation is a discount usability method. The whole point of it is to get information back quickly and easily without having to engage real users. You will eventually go into like real user studies, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. You want evaluators to go through the UI twice and see where it doesn't comply with heuristics. You have them all rate severity. You combine all your findings from 3 to 5 people. You discuss the problems with the design team. And then you go out and you improve your design for the next iteration of the implementation. Questions? All right, I will see you on Thursday when we will fight our way through Model Human Processor.